Hi, Robert.
Hi.
So today we are talking about course-based meditation, which isn't something that we hear too often in course circles, and yet meditation is very much a part of the course's practice, and it's also very much a part of the course's story right from the very beginning.
That's true.
And so I'm looking forward to this discussion today.
Yeah, me too. It's such an important topic, and yet there seems to be a general unawareness of it.
Yeah, we'll get into why that is here in a few, huh?
Yeah. So before we start, let me offer a definition of meditation. This is just cobbled together from my own sense of the word and various definitions online. So here's what it is. Meditation is an intentional, mental, and usually spiritual practice that involves a minimum of inner verbalizing and discursive thought, in which the mind is quieted, and a technique is used, such as mindfulness or a concentrated focus on a thought, object, or sound, to train attention and reach a heightened level of spiritual awareness.
Yeah, and we should say here at the beginning that meditation has been secularized lately to the point where it seems to be, at least in popular culture, more about being non-reactive than it is about hitting some sort of spiritual mountaintop. And so do you want to talk about the difference between the utilitarian function of meditation versus the spiritual function?
Well, yeah. I mean, I have mixed reactions to all that. One positive thing is that by secularizing it, it's been able to go mainstream to a surprising degree. I mean, it's crazy how much you read mentions of people meditating and talking positively about a meditation practice just out in the culture
I
these
used to
days.
teach it in corporate, which
Yeah.
just stop and think about that for a second. Teaching meditation to corporate audiences. It's mind-blowing
Yeah.
that it's become embedded in the culture to that level.
Yeah. And I think that's great. I think it's great that there is a huge amount of research out there about the benefits of meditation in all kinds of ways.
Well,
And
that's why it's become so popular, as the science has caught up to what monastics have known for eons.
yeah, or is catching up.
Hmm.
Um, on the other hand, meditation springs from a spiritual context in traditions all over the world, and I don't think we should lose sight of that or shy away from that. So while we can celebrate the fact that it's going out there to the culture in secularized form, we also need to affirm that it's essentially a spiritual practice.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you brought that out, because it is. I mean, even secular mindfulness meditation, which is what is spreading so fast, has spiritual roots that are often ignored in the spread of the practice itself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. On purpose, but yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's too bad that for something to spread. I mean, I think a day is coming, I don't know how soon, when something can be avowedly spiritual and go big like that.
One day.
Yeah, one day. Yeah. Okay, shall we go on?
Yes.
So, why do we meditate? And I'm talking about why do we meditate in the Course? The ultimate goal is to experience God and our true self. The workbook in particular wants to train us to have that experience and have it increasingly. At the same time, such experiences are comparatively rare, and even if we don't reach that height, the workbook mentions experiencing, quote, a sense of relaxation, a deep sense of joy, and an increased alertness. So we can experience highly beneficial states even without reaching the heights.
Yeah, and that's again an important point to draw out, because I think if we are meditation is a practice of discipline, and if we're going to be disciplined about it, we have to be motivated, and we have to understand why we're doing it in the first place. And so the spectrum of what we're going for is from the mountaintop of revelation, that
Mm-hmm. Right.
oneness with God, all the way down to heightened relaxation. And that's just such a wide gap. How do you know when you're succeeding?
Well, the workbook actually gives us some signs of successful meditation. He says you should feel a sense of relaxation and a feeling of approaching, if not actually entering, into light. Another lesson talks about having a sense of increased alertness, a joyful peace rather than a sluggish peace. But basically, I think from doing it day in and day out and seeing the beneficial effects. In fact, the way I think of it is that in the Course, meditation is there to have our day become founded on a different state of mind. And if we can start the day on that different state of mind, we can use the various workbook practices that take place during the day to, as much as possible, retain that state of mind all day long.
Yeah. And I won't take you too far off your sheet here. But at the same time, I do recognize stages of meditation and a journey, at least from my own experience, where it has started with increased relaxation, moving to increased concentration and focus, moving to opening more space for the Holy Spirit to enter, up to receiving guidance. And that's where I'm right now, is the guidance piece. And I know that there's more levels and layers beyond that, but I can speak for my own practice that it has been that's been my evolution. Can you say the same for yours?
Not exactly. I think that for me, it's just always been about getting into a state that feels both peaceful and heightened. And that allows me to basically start my day in a different way and have a different kind of day.
A day that's focused on God.
It's focused on God, and that in which my mind feels more heightened. There's a very different kind of day for me. If I've had a good meditation, my mind feels heightened, alert, and sensitive to the Course's truths. And if I haven't had a good meditation, those truths often feel like just words, like they bounce off my skull. They don't mean anything. And I feel sort of more dense, more egoic.
Mm-hmm. And then do you also find that you're walking through that utility door with meditation too, where you're non-reactive? And so you're having this more heightened spiritual experience because your day was started in meditation, but you're also just a better guy as a result of it too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So both things are going on at once.
Yeah. I mean, it just makes for it like casts a light on the day that makes it a different day, makes me a better person.
Okay. So before we get into where and how meditation appears in the different volumes of the Course, can you talk a little bit about why students don't refer much to meditation at all? This isn't something you hear about much in the Course community, as I mentioned in the intro. And why do you think that is? Why aren't we talking about this more?
Okay, I think there are two main reasons. One is that the word is almost not there in the Course, at least in the FIP edition. Okay, and people need the word. With the CE, there are a number of mentions of the word meditation in the Course, which have been edited out systematically. All the positive ones, at least.
What? So I just want to be clear. There's 7 references to meditation in the CE total, or
in the text.
In just the text? Okay.
But that's almost the total because there's only one in the workbook.
And then those references were edited out in the FIP. Why?
Well, my theory is that it's just part of a huge pattern in the editing, which was removing specific things you could point to in the world. Mm-hmm. And so meditation, you could point to someone sitting there meditating, and those specifics got systematically edited out.
So it's really interesting. So meditation, I know we're going to get into this, but meditation appears in, well, actually, let's just get into to how it appears in the book itself.
Let me mention the other reason I think that we don't talk
Okay,
about
go ahead.
it. And that is simply that I don't think we take the workbook practice very seriously. We don't think of it as a serious spiritual discipline. If we did, and we followed the instructions carefully, I think anybody pretty much would notice that at a certain point in the workbook, we start being taught how to meditate. The word's not used, but you don't need the word. It's so obvious.
Yeah, you want to give your car example?
Yeah. So if you say, I came to work today in this, metal vehicle with 4 tires and a combustion engine, no one would say, well, what do you call that?
Right.
I mean, it's obvious. So to me, that's exactly what's going on. The workbook teaches us to do what anybody would recognize, I think, as meditation if they were taking the instructions truly seriously.
I know we're jumping ahead a little bit, and I'll back us up to how and where it appears in the text, and then we'll get to the workbook. But I just want to underscore the point that you're making here about the fact that because the word isn't used, we aren't talking about meditation in the course. And it shows up for the first time in lesson 41 with a lot of fanfare. And may I just read?
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So in paragraph 5, it says, there will be one long practice period today. In the morning, as soon as you get up, if possible, sit quietly for some 3 to 5 minutes with your eyes closed. Now, it doesn't say meditation, but yet that's exactly what you're doing here. And so why?
Well, I think there's other ones where we close our eyes for 3 to 5 minutes or longer, but I wouldn't call them meditation. That one I would, because of what we're told to do once we close our eyes.
Well, okay, then repeat today's idea very slowly, then make no effort to think of anything. Try instead to get a sense of turning inward, past all the idle thoughts of the world. Try to enter very deeply into your own self, keeping your mind clear of any thoughts that might distract your attention. So when you continue on with that paragraph, then yeah, it's clearly meditation, even though the word isn't used.
Right. Yeah, so I think it's just, and I think the other reason is that the most influential teachers haven't talked about it. And in my experience, it's almost like a topic is not noticed in the course until you hear the influential teachers and maybe your fellow study group members talking about it. You can't see it until you hear it.
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully we'll inspire more conversation around the practice of meditation in the course. So
hopefully
I'll get us back to your paper here. So how and when did meditation appear before the course came to be?
Okay, so I want to talk about it in all 3 of the volumes, in one of the supplements, the Song of Prayer, but even before the volumes, as you're saying, meditation was part of the story of the course. So when Helen and Bill had their joining and trying to find a better way in 1965, Bill started reading spiritual literature and suggested that the two of them, he and Helen, meditate together, and Helen finally agreed. It was during those meditations that she had the first of her inner visions, which became such an important part of the lead up to the course's dictation.
The first being the priestess vision that we've talked about in the podcast before.
Yeah, so the priestess kneeling in chains next to this sacred fire. That happened.
I love the priestess. Yeah. I want to do a whole separate podcast on the priestess at some point.
I guess we could. I mean, there's a whole cameo on it in the CE, so yeah, we could.
Yeah.
Okay, so then the day before the course began coming through, Helen was receiving this discourse from Jesus that she had requested about how Bill can hear guidance better. And one of the things that Bill needed to do was concentrate more effectively while trying to seek guidance. And so Jesus said this: suggest a very short phrase like, "Here I am, Lord," and don't think of anything else. Just pull in your mind slowly from everywhere else and center it on these words. Now that's meditation.
It is. And I love how present meditation is at the beginning of the course's origin, and how much a part of, as I mentioned before, the story of the course it is, because I think we can all relate to both Helen and Bill's experiences. If you've meditated long enough, you can relate to Helen's experience where it's something that you don't want to do, and then you sit down and then you have these powerful things that happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then you can also relate to Bill's experience where, I don't know if you mentioned it here, but Jesus says something about his mind flinting about, and he needs to concentrate to hear the guidance come through. I mean, who can't relate to the mind flinting about? And then I think at one point, I don't know if it's in relation to meditation, but he talks about Bill hanging up. Can you say a little bit more about that? Because
well, that's in relation to receiving guidance, that Bill hangs up too quickly. So Jesus has to make his messages too short, and they become cryptic.
Mm-hmm.
To know when Bill's going to ring off.
Well, we're going to get into getting guidance through meditation, but I relate to that so much, where in the process of meditation, when guidance is coming through, my mind, sometimes it'll get it, but sometimes it'll flint about, and sometimes it'll hang up because I'm afraid of what might come in. And so I just relate so much to both Helen and Bill and their experiences with meditation in the early part of the course's history.
Yeah, the part where his mind flits about too much and he needs to concentrate better, that's right where he says, focus on here I am, Lord.
Yeah. And just here I am, Lord, is a beautiful centering exercise.
Oh, it is. I mean, it basically is an act of making yourself very present to God.
I try and say it upon waking.
Yeah, I read about it for years without ever thinking, well, I should actually meditate on that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but once I did, I came to love it.
Yeah. I remember I used to wake with, what would you have me do? Where would you have me go? What would you have me say? And to whom? And you and I were talking about that. And you said, before you get into the business of the day, why don't you spend time just saying, here I am, like being present to God. And I do that now. And it's not sitting meditation, but at the same time, it feels meditative in the sense of just waking and saying, yes, I'm here and I'm
That's great.
ready.
That's great.
Okay.
Good advice. Definitely.
All right.
Even though it was mine. Okay. So with the text, once the text begins,
I love it when you're impressed with yourself.
Jesus speaks approvingly of Helen and Bill's efforts to meditate. He counsels Helen in how to get past the fears that are arising during her meditations a couple of times. So meditation, as you've already said, is mentioned 7 times in the CE text. And here is one example. Now, this is a very famous course quote that we only tend to know in its edited form, which was salvation is a collaborative venture. But here's the original quote. Meditation is a collaborative venture with God. It cannot be undertaken successfully by those who disengage themselves from the sonship because they are disengaging themselves from me, meaning Jesus.
So it was originally meditation is a collaborative venture, and you think it got changed to salvation as a collaborative venture because meditation just seemed too much in the world of form?
It just fits the pattern. If it's specific, for the most part, they would take it out or change it.
Well, it's also, again, I was saying before about meditation being such a discipline, and there are times when you just don't want to do it, right? And so what is that motivation that's going to get you over the hump to sit down and do this practice? And one of those, for me at least, is understanding that this is a meeting with God. This is a collaborative venture with God. And what the hell else do I have to do that's more important than that? Yeah. So I just feel like if we can really absorb the fact that this is a collaborative venture with God, then there's nothing more important than you can do with your day than that. And that becomes the motivation to do the practice.
Yeah, and these comments in the text, which are approving with some caveats, like don't meditate in such a way that you disengage yourself from relationship with others. But overall, they're approving. And those approving comments are so much of what can provide our motivation, like you're saying. We never read about it, What does that do to our motivation?
What you just said was interesting. Where does it talk about where does it warn against being so isolated that it interferes with your interpersonal relationships?
There's a couple of places. One is the quote I just read. It cannot be undertaken successfully by those who disengage themselves from the sonship. So in other words, you can't separate yourself from others and successfully join yourself with God. And then another one is where he talked about how Helen was trying to find the Holy Spirit in herself alone, and that's why her meditations had frightened her. Because she was looking for God, she was going on an ego alien journey, looking for the Holy Spirit, with the ego as guide, looking in herself alone. And so, that was changed to that. This is why your thoughts have frightened you, not your meditations have frightened you.
Can we pause here a minute and talk about Helen's original fear of meditation and why that was? So explain more about that.
Yeah, there were actually two fears mentioned. One is the one I just talked about, but earlier there's another one that didn't make it in any form into the FIP edition. And that's where he said that basically she'd been trying to suspend her judgments, which you do in meditation, right? Trying to leave them at the door. But instead, she only managed a partway version. The partway version was letting go of control over them. So now, rather than her mind being empty of judgments, it was basically full of out-of-control judgments.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Then he said, because you have a tendency to be self-punishing, in other words, she had these out-of-control, it's almost like a internal Tourette's syndrome, where her mind would be blurting out judgmental thoughts, and then she'd feel guilty. She'd punish herself, and that made her afraid of meditating at all.
Yeah, and I know that hasn't been your experience with meditation, but that has absolutely been my experience with meditation. When I started meditating as a teenager, I had Helen's exact experience where I quieted my mind only to be confronted with the darkest parts of my nature, and that scared me. And I heard Sam Harris say at one point that when we get to this isn't a course related, because he says when you get to the very, very center of your mind, you realize everyone's a murderer and a rapist, and of course, from a course perspective, when you get to the center of your mind, you realize that that's where we're connected to God. That's where God lives, and that's where our pull stems from.
Right.
But I do think that is something important to address about meditation, because when we think about what motivates us to do it and what motivates us not to do it, facing those out of control judgments, just like in Helen's experience, is one reason why I think people would avoid the practice at all if it frightens them in that way. Do you have
That's so interesting.
Do you have any advice for someone who's feeling that fear that Helen had and that I had?
Well, since I haven't experienced it, the only advice is what Jesus gave to Helen, which was basically stop for now. And then when you're ready to try it again, something in your mind will tell me, and then I'll tell you, and then we sit down and do it together. And I think, my analogy is, if you feel like your hand's out of control and may do, hurtful things, then what better thing to do than to sit down and hold hands with somebody you trust?
I love the kind of teacher that Jesus is. He doesn't judge Helen. He doesn't judge us. He just says, when you're ready, you'll tell me and I'll be here and we'll try again.
Yeah.
It's kind of beautiful.
It is. It is.
Okay.
Okay. So in the workbook, meditation plays a huge role in the workbook. It's all over the place. It doesn't begin till lesson 41, as you pointed out. But when it does begin, it's, the workbook makes a big deal of it, calls it a major goal of mind training in lesson 44, which is the second one. Speaks of, quote, our first real attempt to get past this dark and heavy cloud and to go through it to the light beyond. That's 41. It says this is a practice, quote, we will utilize increasingly. And says we will go into more detail in connection with this kind of practice as we go along. Talks about how sooner or later it's always successful. A big deal is made of this kind of practice. He just doesn't call it meditation.
And
then
yet, go ahead.
From there, it becomes an absolute staple of our morning and evening practice all through to the end of the workbook.
Yeah, and I'm questioning where I want to go with this, because there's so many parts to meditation in the workbook. We're talking about in review 2, where it says you wait on messages. There are aspects of meditation, your personal practice of meditation, that the workbook says heal others that you haven't met. There's just so much there that there's so many threads that I want to take you on in this. And so do we pause here and go on some of those threads, or do you want to go on to the manual and the Song of Prayer and then come back to the workbook?
Why don't we go on and then come back? Because I want to talk fairly thoroughly about what I see as the 3 different methods.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that can get us into some of these other topics. I would say that the main goal of meditation in the Course is experiential. It's not receiving guidance. And yet, he does say again and again that the way to receive guidance is to basically meditate, quiet your mind, and that even when you're not aiming for receiving guidance or something else from the Holy Spirit, just aiming to empty your mind and open it to God, the Holy Spirit may use that opportunity to step in and tell you something you need to know.
Mm-hmm.
So the 2 topics are very closely intertwined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they're so intertwined with me that, as I was mentioning before, it's through meditation where I receive the most guidance.
That's great. That's very much how the Course talks. Okay, so in the manual, this focus continues in section 16 of the manual, which talks about how we spend our day practice-wise after the workbook's over. It talks about having a morning and evening, quote, quiet time as the foundation of our day. In this time, we do what the workbook taught us, close our eyes and spend time with God, attempting to, quote, join with Him. Obviously, he's talking about meditation here, and he expects that we did enough of that in the workbook that we know what he's talking about.
Oh, you do enough of it in the workbook.
You do if you actually do exactly what he asks.
Can anyone do exactly what he asks in the workbook? I
think it's certainly possible, and I don't think we have to be exact. We just have to say, oh, okay, so I'm supposed to close my eyes and do this and this and this, not I'm supposed to close my eyes and float.
Right, but that's what's so astonishing about the way in which meditation has been missed in the community, is that it's not only so much a part of the workbook, but the practice instructions around it are so specific.
Yeah, well, they're really specific for a time. Like we get really specific instructions in the 40s. And then with Name of God meditation, we get specific instructions in 183. And with open mind meditation, we get instructions that are more specific, scattered here and there. But to some degree, you have to remember, once you've passed those instructions, what they are. And to some degree, you have to step back and see the whole pattern.
Mm-hmm. And you think that may be part of the reason why we've missed it, is that Jesus introduces it and then assumes we've got it and then moves on. Okay.
And that's a habit of his all over the Course. He'll really introduce something thoroughly, and then he kind of assumes you've gotten it, and then he refers back to it, but not with anywhere near the same thoroughness as where he introduced it.
So is there anything else that you want to say about the way in which meditation appears in the manual?
Not really. It's in that one section, section 16, but it plays a really big role in that one section.
So that section is, how should the teacher of God spend his day?
Right.
And a cornerstone of that is morning and evening quiet time.
Yeah, he spends a lot of time talking about those.
And I think like you, my morning quiet time is good. My evening quiet time is lacking. So,
But we probably don't have time to get into that.
oh,
We
stop.
probably should move on.
but for but for someone who's just listening and they are trying to build a practice, can you just talk briefly about what an evening quiet time would look like, particularly if the manual addresses it as how to spend our day?
Yeah, well, there's supposed to be bookends. We're supposed to do essentially the same thing in the evening as in the morning. And I just find A, that my evening tends to be full of other things. And B, when I close my eyes in the evening, I
You
want,
fall asleep.
I fall asleep. And that's not part of Course meditation. He
Oh, it's not.
cautions,
Sleeping isn't part of
well,
the
but there
practice.
are some meditations where it's okay to kind of drop off for a while and then come back. And in the Course, he doesn't want you to do that.
Yeah. I think
So,
dropping off to sleep isn't exactly what he's referring to.
well, there are techniques, like centering prayer, where it's kind of okay to just, you know, dip down into sleep and then dip back up into meditating. Or
Are you just
right.
saying that to make yourself feel better when you fall asleep in the middle of your meditations?
No, I'm,
Moving
I'm
on.
saying that just to clarify. Forget it.
No, but I do like what you say here in the discussion guide that we keep this focus through our morning and evening quiet times on the attempt to quote join with him. And
Right.
I just think if we keep that focus, then we'll always have the motivation. At least that's a huge motivator for me to actually do it. So
Yeah, I mean it's not just a spiritual practice in the Course. It's specifically, more often than not, a God focus on the
mhm.
attempt to reach and experience God.
Right. Okay. So this, I'm really excited about this piece of the discussion because meditation in the Song of Prayer is quite beautiful. So do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, the Song of Prayer talks about prayer, but in the Course, meditation and prayer are kind of hard to, you know, divide. They are continuous with each other. So he talks about the lower rungs of the ladder of prayer as consisting of asking for God for specific things. But then what he calls true prayer, he's not into asking God for specific things, by the way. What he calls true prayer is, quote, a stepping aside, a letting go, a quiet time of listening and loving, a giving up of yourself to be at one with love. This true prayer sounds just like meditation, sounds like course based meditation. And he then talks about prayer ultimately being the heavenly state. So that, the state of oneness with God, in which there are no words and there's no form, that's where true prayer is trying to take us to sort of, an eternal meditation.
Yeah. And I love that evolution from asking God for things as the starting point. Who doesn't relate to that? Who hasn't started
Yeah.
there?
Yeah.
All the way up to what is essentially a meditation. And in that case, meditation is synonymous with prayer. And so the highest form of it is just sitting there and resting in God. And that is both a meditation and a prayer. And I just find that
Right.
whole concept gorgeous.
Yeah, it is. I've often focused on the song of what, it's the method that it puts forward, if you can call it that, especially that line, a giving up of yourself to be at one with love. So
Yeah.
you're kind of just giving yourself into God's hands. You're not praying for things. You're basically praying for God.
Yeah. And it's that journey too of, you know, starting with here's what I think I need, Lord. Here's what I want, Lord. Here's what I'd like you to provide for me, Lord. All the way up to, oh, the only thing I need is this.
Yeah. Here I
And
am, Lord.
here I am. Yeah. Here's what I want, Lord, to here I am, Lord. And that's an incredible growth. And I can't help but feel though that part of why students have so much trouble with meditation is that we value the things more than we value being present to God.
Well, yeah. I mean, that is the ladder of prayer in the Song of Prayer. The ladder of prayer has these two sides. One is kind of a ladder of relationship, and the other is the ladder of desire. And the ladder of desire is where you go from wanting the things of the world pretty much solely to just wanting God. And that is the ladder of our spiritual development. So you can't rush that. You can't say overnight, oh, I just want God. You have to go through a long evolution to get to that point.
But isn't it interesting that when you go through that spiritual evolution where you realize, this is where I'm at right now in my own spiritual journey, is where you get to the place where you sincerely know, at least you're trying to get to the place where you know that God is all that you need and that He will provide what is best for you. And everything that you do flows from that versus that place where you're grasping at the things that you think you want. And it's two different ways of seeing and being. And the Course is pushing us more towards the first, but we don't want it as much as we say we do. We don't actually want it
No,
as
we
much as we
don't.
say we
It's
do.
a long slide from the one to the other. That's just how it goes. I mean, you can't, to have the nature of your desires change doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah, and it just feels like such a sacrifice. I'm going to sacrifice my happiness to want God's will for me.
Right.
And yet that is the practice. And if you can get to where it's not only the practice, but it's your motivation, wow. Then
yeah. Well, that's a pretty high state of development. If for it to be what you really truly want, you want God more than all the usual stuff.
But that's the top of the ladder.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay.
So in my view, there are basically 3 techniques of meditation in the workbook. I mean, it's always fluid and changing, but I think it's pretty easy to group them in terms of these 3 techniques. Okay, so one is what I call down and inward meditation. That's what's introduced in lessons 41 and 44. And let me just read my summary of the meditation technique itself. Concentrate on sinking down and inward toward the center of your mind, where God and your true identity wait for you. While doing so, hold a heightened sense of intention, filled with confidence, desire, and a sense of the importance and holiness of what you are doing. Whenever your mind wanders, draw it back with a specific technique. So there's basically, to me, I think there's 3 parts of this. One is the basic motion, where you're sinking down and inward towards the center of your mind. It's not to a place in your body. The second one is while doing that basic motion, you hold this heightened sense of intention, filled with confidence, desire, etc. And the third part is whenever your mind wanders, you intentionally draw it back with a specific technique, which can be as simple as repeating the idea for the day.
And it can also be, I know your favorite technique and mine when it comes to mind wandering is this thought I do not want, I choose instead, and repeating the lesson.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Any others?
That's a really great one.
I do
There's
that
a lot
all
of them.
the time. I do that so many times during my meditation.
Yeah, well, the mind wanders regularly. I mean, unless you're highly, highly trained, it's going to wander every 10 to 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a lot of opportunity there to repeat that.
Yeah, and I just want to say that again. That's a really, really important technique, and it's a really effective one. This thought I do not want, I choose instead. Then say the lesson title.
It's wordy but surprisingly effective.
Mm-hmm.
It always makes my meditations deep in a chunk.
Mm-hmm. What else?
Okay, so
what else for my?
Well, we often repeat the idea for the day. We'll often repeat the idea for the day plus an extra thought. I would remember this or something like that. I wrote an article in which I listed about a dozen techniques for bringing the wandering mind back.
Do you have it that we can include in the show notes?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Sure, I'll send it to you. Okay, so the next technique is Name of God meditation. And that's taught really in Lesson 183, even though it's referred to in a couple, 3 other places. So my summary says, repeat God's name over and over. So that's the basic thing you do. Repeat God's name over and over as an invitation that you are certain God will answer as the only wish we have. This is a quote. The only sound with any meaning. And as, quote, the all-encompassing idea that holds your mind completely. I love that line, by the way. The all-encompassing idea that holds your mind completely. So you're repeating God's name, but you're doing it with a certain amount of intention and feeling. It's like the only thing you want. It's an invitation to God to come to you. It's the all-encompassing idea that holds your mind completely. So then whenever your mind wanders to things of the world, you repeat his name to draw your attention back, realizing that those names signify nothing, while God's name signifies everything. So there's a kind of a similar, actually, tripartite structure to this one too. The basic thing is you repeat God's name. The next thing is you do so with a certain kind of intention and feeling. And the final thing is you draw your mind back from wandering with a particular technique, basically repeating God's name again. So there's a real parallel with the first kind of meditation there.
Yeah, and this is the meditation that I love the most in the course, and I think it's probably because it has the most in common with the way in which I was trained in centering prayer.
Mm-hmm.
And I know centering prayer is very popular these days, where you take one word and you focus on that word for the length of your meditation. But the difference is that, at least the way in which I was taught centering prayer, it's more about the breath, where you have the word Father is the one that I choose in both centering prayer and name of God. But it's an inhale, like Fa, exhale, there. And so the whole practice is, however long you sit, breathing in Father. And what I find when I do it that way is that my focus is more on the breath. But when I do the name of God meditation, the focus is on that longing, the all-encompassing idea that holds your mind completely. Well, are you focusing on the idea, or are you focusing on your breath? Those are two different things. And I love this for pulling out the correct focus.
Yeah, well, the Thomas Keating book, Open Mind, Open Heart, I don't think that, I know there were like a few originators of centering prayer, and Father Keating was one of them, but his book did not have a big focus on the breath that I remember. In fact, my memory was that you say the name, the word, they call it the sacred word or something like that, and you lay it in your mind like placing a feather on a piece of absorbent cotton, and you don't say it incessantly. There's a kind of a light touch with the word. However, the difference here, I think, is you're saying it with much more will and emotion in the Course's version. The only wish we have.
Mm-hmm. Doesn't it use language? Did you say it here with burning intensity?
No, there is no burning intensity here, but this technique does remind me a great deal of the technique in the Cloud of Unknowing, which is a medieval mystical text that was the inspiration for centering prayer. But in the Cloud of Unknowing, there's nothing like that feather on a piece of absorbent cotton. You take the word and you use it to beat upon the cloud that lies in between you and God, and you say the word as a dart of longing love.
Okay. Where did I get burning intensity then?
I don't know.
But the distinction here, I think, is worth illuminating, because what are you focusing on in your meditation? Are you focusing on the Are you holding the thought lightly like a feather on a pillow, or are you really going for this because you are desiring God? And again, I think it just goes back to how much do we really want that? But if you can know what you really want based on what you're focusing on when you sit.
Yeah, I don't know why the centering prayer originators took it away from the dart of longing love to the feather on the absorbent cotton.
Because we don't want the burning intensity for God.
I suspect
to make it more palatable.
I think they were adapting it to the prevalence of Eastern meditation in the U.S. and in Western culture, because there's this idea that it should be really dispassionate,
right?
And
you shouldn't have to believe in anything to do it.
Well, these are Catholics. I mean, they believe in a lot, right?
No, you're talking about neutering the practice of meditation to make it more broadly applicable.
I'm not sure if it was broadly applicable, but maybe more widely attractive, for people who have been influenced by the East. I don't know. I'm not a mind reader, but I just find that for me to say it as the only wish I have, as a dart of longing love, as an invitation to God to come to me, it engages more of me and it makes for a better meditation. Mm-hmm. Now, for some people, maybe the other will be better, but surely this is a valid way to go. I mean, the original Cloud of Unknowing, you actually beat upon the cloud with the word.
Mm-hmm. And that echoes the objective of this in the workbook, because if you had to pick one thing that the practice of meditation in the workbook was driving you towards, it's this relationship with God, isn't it? More than anything else, more than your own inner peace, more than your own guidance, it's this direct connection to God.
Yeah, it is. The second place would be the experience of your true self. But that is, I think, a pretty distant second. It's the main focus is God.
Is there a third place?
I don't know what the third one would be.
Sleeping?
No.
I'm kidding.
Yeah, so there's a heavy, heavy God focus, which I think we course students tend to be a bit uncomfortable with. But, it can be so nourishing to embrace that focus.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Where are we now?
We're going to the final technique,
okay,
which is open mind meditation. That's just my term for it. It's not, the different instructions in this are not connected with each other, but there's a pattern. As we get into the second half of the year, in Review 5, starting with Lesson 171, Review 6, Part 2 of the workbook, and then all the way to the introduction to the final lessons in the workbook, all those final chunks of the workbook are focused on a style of meditation in which we don't repeat words, except when drawing our mind back from wandering. So we open our minds and leave them empty of words, leave them empty of normal thinking, and we try to leave them empty of beliefs, which obviously go a lot deeper than just fleeting thoughts. Right?
So we empty
our minds.
What kind of beliefs are we trying to empty?
Well, Lesson 189, everything says, be still and lay aside all thoughts of what you are and what God is. All images you have learned about the world, all concepts you hold about yourself, and it just goes through everything you think is either good or bad or true or false. Forget this world, forget this course, and come with wholly empty hands unto your God. So it's empty your mind of everything you believe. Don't even think about the course.
Okay, I want to pause on that, because that is the line that is cited. And one of my bugaboos is that people use the course as some of these lines as a reason to withdraw from the world. And so that line that you just cited, come with empty hands, say it again.
Forget this course, forget this world, forget this course, and come with wholly empty hands unto your God.
And oftentimes that's used as an excuse to withdraw from the world when it was really a meditation instruction.
Well, what I find, it was, absolutely. But what I find is that people love to quote it because it says, forget this course, which makes you wonder about, what kind of ambivalence must they have towards the course, that that's like one of their favorite lines in the course, forget this course. It's like, take my wife, please.
Well, I think it's also, if you understand what the course is asking of you, as it relates to desiring God first and foremost, and as it relates to these intense practice instructions, if you don't want to do it, if you don't want to put God first, and if you don't want to go to the discipline of what the course is asking you to do in the workbook, then you can say, well, the course says forget this course, and
Yeah.
therefore I don't have to do it. So it could be an excuse for not doing what's asked of us as well.
It could be. Yeah. Well, I do think course students tend to have a fairly ambivalent relationship with the course. We love to quote, words are but symbols of symbols. Words are basically useless, but the course is just a bunch of words. We love to quote, forget this course. What does that say? Anyway, let me go ahead and read my summary of this meditation technique. So this is really the crowning meditation technique in the course. I find it the most challenging, the most difficult. Hold your mind in a state that is empty of words, no words to repeat, thoughts, and all you believe, and open to God, waiting in silent, restful expectancy for Him to dawn above the horizon of your mind. When your mind wanders, you can use words to draw it back to silent, nonverbal waiting. So that's when you can use words. Be open to the Holy Spirit stepping in with guidance for your day, or even with specific instructions for your meditation time. So the basic idea here is you create this vacuum in your mind where it's empty of words, thoughts, and beliefs, and expectantly open to God. And you're just holding that, obviously holding it non-verbally, without any specific verbal forms to help you keep your focus. That's why I think it's the most difficult one.
Because our mind just wants to flint about.
Right. We want to float about, but we also want to grab on to something that we can focus on. And here that there is a focus, this silent, expectant waiting for God to arrive, but there's no form to that.
Right. I find this meditation absolutely fascinating because you're waiting in silent, restful expectancy. And I'd love to hear more from you about what it is that we're waiting for.
Well, we're just waiting for the experience
Of
of God.
which is?
Well, it's everything. I mean, it's peace, it's joy, it's love, it's our true self. But it's the supreme experience one can have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's how everybody always asks the question, well, how do you know it's working? How do you know that this meditation practice is working? And it's working when not only do you have a different day, but you become a different person.
Yeah.
And part of it is that when you create that space for God to come in with love and joy and peace, of course it flows out into your behaviors. And you are different as a result of it. And so what is more beautiful than sitting and waiting for those gifts to come to you in this way?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a great line from Houston Smith where he said something like, what we're seeking surely is not altered states, but altered traits.
That is beautiful.
Yeah.
That is beautiful. Okay. So where do we go from here?
Well, I don't think I need to go through anything else in my notes particularly. I think we've pretty much covered things.
Okay.
Unless you don't agree.
I don't agree. I want to take you through your discussion guide, at least to the end of it, which is, we're almost at the end of it. But I do want to pause here and talk about some specific things related to course-based meditation practice. And one that ties into what we were just talking about in open mind meditation is in review 2, it says, I love this. I'm fascinated with this. In paragraph 3, it says, there is a message waiting for you. Be confident that you will receive it. Remember that it belongs to you and that you want it. Do not allow your intent to waver in the face of distracting thoughts. Realize that whatever form they take, they have no meaning and no power. Replace them with your determination to succeed. Now, tell me if I'm wrong, but that is what I bring into open mind meditation, where I'm emptying my mind of thoughts and beliefs, but I'm waiting for something to come through. And is that part of this practice?
It's very similar to open mind meditation. I think in open mind meditation, you're not so much waiting for a message. You're waiting for an experience. But the waiting is very similar in review 2, which I find also pretty difficult, because you're not repeating anything. You're just waiting for this message to arrive in your mind. So it is very similar in that respect to open mind meditation.
I like that distinction. You're not waiting for a message, you're waiting for an experience. So at some points, you're waiting for an experience, and at some points, you're waiting for a message.
And to make it even more confusing, at some points, you're waiting for an experience, but what happens is you open the door thereby to the Holy Spirit, who shows up and gives you a message.
Clear as mud, once again.
Yeah. But the Course, it likes that fluidity.
Mm-hmm. But I also want to emphasize that there are many, many times when you sit and you have neither an experience nor a message, and that doesn't mean that the meditation wasn't successful. Do you want to say more about that?
Well, the Course does say in a couple of places, and one of them is quite lengthy and I find quite moving, that even if you don't think it did any good, on some deeper level, some element in you was released to being with God, and that at some point that will kind of bubble up to the conscious level, and you'll experience what happened on that deeper level at that time.
Yeah, and what you're saying also reminds me of lesson 132, I loose the world from all that I thought it was, and I'm not going to be able to find it. Oh, here it is. Paragraph 16 says, you need not realize that healing comes to many brothers far across the world, as well as to the ones you see nearby, as you send out these thoughts to bless the world. And so what I get from that is that as we sit in our own meditation practice, even if we think it's not successful, just the very act of doing it blesses others that we, in ways that we can't know. So, and that this isn't the only reference to that idea in the workbook.
There's many. I've categorized 11, I think.
Yes. Say more about that, like how our practice blesses others that blesses others in ways that we don't know.
Well, the premise is that our minds are joined. And so when the light enters one mind, it fans out and affects all minds, both generally, and there's even a sense that the Holy Spirit specifically guides it into minds that are particularly open to those gifts. And then all that returns to us and comes back as benefit to us. And so there are a number of lessons that talk about that. Lesson 97, I Am Spirit, is probably the main one. But there's, like I say, 11 that I'm aware of.
That's another motivation to me to actually do the practice, is that if I'm sitting, it's almost like I feel like I have some responsibility to my brothers for and through my own meditation practice. So if I'm not feeling it, one thing that can get me over that hump is thinking, I'm not just doing this for me.
And that's why he's saying it, because it feels often like it's self-indulgent. I'm sitting here not doing things I ought to be doing that need to be done. I'm just indulging myself in navel gazing. And he's specifically trying to counteract that and say, no, you're blessing the world. One of the things that I think is particularly interesting is he says that he not only bless people distant in space, but even distant in time. You can bless people from the past or the future.
Yeah, that is fast. Where is that? Which lesson is that in?
I think that might be in 124, but I'm
I
not sure. Yeah, not
Okay,
sure.
you don't have to look it up, but that idea is absolutely incredible to think that you can not only bless those here now, but those who were before,
Right, because time's
who
an
are
illusion. It's all simultaneous.
also here now.
Yeah, so I mean, it's not what we expect the course to say. At the same time, we should.
Yeah. Okay, another question on meditation. I find great value in meditating with a group.
Mm.
And there is one
One
reference to
reference.
it, as
Yeah.
you like to remind me,
Yeah.
and it's in 183, which is the lesson that inspired the Name of God meditation practice. But in paragraph 5, it says, "And should you join a brother as you sit with him in silence and repeat God's name along with him within your quiet minds, you have established that there is an altar which reaches to God himself and to his Son." So if there's only one reference to group-based meditation, I imagine the Course doesn't place a lot of weight on it. And yet, it's still a beautiful thing to think that together we can establish an altar which reaches to God himself. So do you have anything to say about the power or effectiveness of meditating in a collective group?
Well, I don't think we should surmise that because it's only said once that it's not a big deal. I mean, what's said in that one place is a big deal,
Right.
right? You've established an altar that reaches to God and to his Son. Um,
That's no little thing.
that's no little thing. Yeah, I mean, the workbook assumes that you're doing these lessons by yourself. And yet, throughout the course, there's a lot of focus on the power of joining. You know, all those holy relationship discussions in the text, you know, throughout those discussions weaves this theme of how powerful it is that the two of you have joined, how powerful that is for the world. So yeah, we should absolutely believe in the power of joining in meditation as well as in joining in other respects.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and the last thing I have on this is also from 183, lesson 183.
Mm-hmm.
Paragraph 7, where it says, "Think not he hears the little prayers of those who call on him with names of idols cherished by the world. They cannot reach him thus. He cannot hear requests that he be not himself or that his son receive another name than this." Now, can you talk about how in our meditation we invite God to be with us, but he can't quite get in unless we're in the right mental state. So we block his presence with our idle thoughts and our mind wandering and all that. So he's trying to get in, but sometimes he can't quite make it through the fog of our own minds. And
Well, like most of the
yeah,
time. Yeah, I mean
can you
that.
say more about that?
Yeah, that passage has been used as like a proof text that God doesn't hear our prayers, when in context it means the exact opposite. Okay, it doesn't say think not he hears your prayers. It says think not. First of all, it's just said, you know, repeat his name, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Then it says, thus do we make an invitation which can never be refused, and God will come and answer it himself. So by repeating his name, we're making an invitation. And in response to that invitation, in which we repeat God's name, God will come and answer it himself. Doesn't that say that he's basically heard the invitation?
Mm-hmm.
But then it says, think not he hears the little prayers. And in the context of that lesson, there's been a running focus on those, on thinking about the idols of the world throughout the whole lesson. And the idea is, if your meditation consists of thinking about what you're going to have for breakfast, you know, how much you're going to get in your paycheck today,
To-do
you know,
lists.
your to-do lists, et cetera, you know, the conversation that you hope to have later in which this key thing that you want will hopefully be obtained. that's not really calling, that's not inviting God, is it? That's inviting the idols, that's praying to the idols of the world. So if you spend your whole meditation praying to the idols of the world, you won't be inviting God. He's not going to come in response to that because your thoughts have a different address than God's. That's all that's being said.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that he doesn't hear our prayers. It's a simple, practical thing of if you spend your time meditating on something other than God, you're not going to have the experience of God as a result.
Yeah, and that's why I was trying to draw out, because again, I'm trying to get to a place where listeners understand what is the motivation for sitting down and doing this, and how do you know when it's working. And if I love what you just said, because if we're sitting down and we're thinking about our to-do list, which is my default mind wandering, God is always there, but he can't get in. And the way that we know that he's getting in is, as we were saying before, you have a different experience. You're feeling that joy, that love, that peace, whatever. So you know that your meditation is working if you have those experiences or you get those messages, etc. But he just can't get through all of this
He's
fog
not being
in our own
invited.
thinking.
I mean, the mind has sovereignty with its power of choice. If it chooses to be with God, it will be with God. But, ruminating about your to-do list is not a choice to be with God. And no one drops into deep peace through that rumination.
Yeah. So part of the technique is switching over to all of the things that we've already described about ways in which you can open that space that allows him to enter.
Right. And what it ultimately comes down to is just wanting him there. That's what it all comes down to.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I think these discussions are important, because they force us to look at all the ways we don't want him there. Because if we did, we wouldn't be occupying our mind with all these other thoughts. So there's
Right.
something in us that doesn't want him there, that doesn't want to invite him, because we're choosing these other thoughts.
Right.
Or we're choosing not to practice in the first place.
Right. So my hope is that what people take away from this is just the thought that as course students, we should have a disciplined meditation practice in which we really faithfully and carefully practice the instructions um, in pursuit of, at the least, relaxation and peace, and at the most, the greatest of all experiences, the experience of God.
And your recommendation is that as students are going through the workbook, they practice the meditation technique that's outlined in the instructions for the lesson that they're on. But when they get out of the workbook, if they're in like post workbook practice, they can choose their own meditation process that works best for them.
Yeah, the idea, obviously, when you're going through the workbook, you should do the lesson you're on that day, right? That goes without saying. After the workbook, he does say individual need becomes the chief consideration.
And your personal practice is name of God mostly? That's the one
Well,
you
for
default to?
years, I did the down and inward. That was like totally my favorite. And then I just kind of transitioned out of it. It stopped working that well. And I became more enamored with name of God meditation. And then what I also do is I'm trying to stretch in the open mind meditation direction, of less words, more just the opening my mind and resting in God, or opening my mind and having that expectant waiting for God. It's such an important part of the course. I feel like I should be really proficient, much more so than I am in that technique.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, here in your discussion guide, you call it the crowning method of the workbook. So
And
you
there's
might want to
no
get that right.
question. Thank you. There's no question that it is. I mean, the second half of the year is like devoted to it.
Okay, so I honestly have no idea how long we have been talking,
I
but
think we've been talking too long, actually.
yeah, I know this is how these things extend well beyond the length of time that they should. But before we go, I did say that I wanted to get you back on the closing remarks and your discussion guide. Is there anything that you want to say that you haven't already said about, you have here, how do we meditate and for how long? Is there anything that you want to say about the length of time that people need to sit? Because that is a question that pops up all the time. How long am I supposed to meditate for?
Well, I would say A, read the discussion guide, but B, follow the instructions for the lesson you're on and realize that where it's heading eventually is not about a set time, but about what your need is.
Yeah, and that's one of the things, that's the hidden association with the question of how long do I meditate for? Because when I hear that, what I also hear is, what's the minimum amount of time that I need to sit in order to get some value out of this? And that's not what the course is asking us to do. What does it say? Something like you sit for as long as it takes to meet your deepest need?
That's in lesson 193. Yeah, I mean, at different places, there's a different focus. For a while, it's for as long as you can. And even after that, he keeps saying, go longer. And then in review 6, it's at least 15 minutes. Mm-hmm. So not less than 15 minutes. And then in part 2, it's just whatever you need to achieve the effect you desire.
And then what's the maximum it instructs us to sit for?
The maximum we're ever told to sit for is 30 minutes. Mm-hmm. And then in the lessons of 153 to 200, we're basically told to go for as long as possible. And he says that longer than 30 minutes would be ideal.
Okay. So we have talked in this podcast. This is my last question. So
everyone's like signed off by now,
No, hardly. I imagine this is if you are interested in practicing the course, which presumably if you're listening to this podcast is a subject of interest to you, then I can't imagine that you would turn off on a discussion like this because it's so integral to the course itself.
It's a hugely important topic.
I'm trying to weave our topics together so that so each podcast doesn't seem so isolated. And one of the things that we have talked about on this podcast is how the world was, I forget which podcast it was, but the world was created by the thoughts of many, not all of whom are pure of heart. Was that the Angels podcast?
I think it was the Trials and Tragedies one.
So the Trials and Tragedies one.
Yeah.
Meditation just seems like a process of harnessing and purifying our thoughts so that maybe our external world wouldn't be so chaotic and destructive if we all were involved in this specific practice. Like we could purify our thoughts through meditation, go out into the world as different beings, having God work through us in these ways, and we can create a different world by being different people, which comes from this practice.
And by just having the effects of our practice while we're in it radiate out to the world. The Course is really big on that, as we said earlier. And, the TM people have done extensive experimentation with that. They call it the Maharishi Effect. It's a really terrific book about that. Where they send teams into certain areas and then measure all the social indicators, and they would invariably go up.
Yeah, they sent teams into communities after an experiment of asking that community to meditate, and then all the markers of social injustice and violence decreased as a result.
Yeah. It's amazing. And it just happened again and again and again.
Yeah. Well, I guess we can't say as a result, but it's an interesting correlation.
Well, yeah, but I mean, what they would do is they'd measure before, they'd send their team in there, they'd measure during, they'd pull the team, they'd measure after. If that repeatedly happens, it has to start seeming like more than correlation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know this isn't spiritual meditation, but we're seeing this in schools where meditation is being introduced to children as young as kindergarten. And what they're finding is that the children aren't acting out as much and detention rates are lowering. So there's just all kinds of benefits to this practice. And it
would be strange if the Course didn't tap into it at all.
Yeah. Robert, thank you very, very much for another incredible discussion. Is there anything else that you want to say before we close?
I think we've probably said enough now.
All right. See you next time.
Okay. Bye-bye.